Everybody, hope you're having a good start to your week, had a good time of worship with your church family. This week we'll be thinking about the synoptic problem, and let me be clear, a problem does not mean that there's a problem with the texts. Sometimes that misconception is made that the synoptic problem is saying that there's some sort of errors in the text, and therefore that's what we're talking about. A problem is a question that remains somewhat difficult to solve. And so some people will say they have solved the synoptic problem. Most would at least admit that there are different views and different capable scholars who hold different views. So the relationship between Matthew, Mark, and Luke, if you haven't already considered this, is one that has caused scholars to scratch their heads. Who wrote first? Who wrote second? Who wrote third? There are different views. Most people today would say Mark wrote first. I, for one, am not convinced. Some people would say that Mark actually wrote last. And in fact, the two theories that are probably most likely, though both have their difficulties, would be that either Mark wrote first or that he wrote last. It's not likely that he wrote in between Matthew and Luke. But one thing I wanted to share about this problem, because it is often considered to be really irrelevant, just simply us scratching an intellectual itch, and doesn't really bear into interpretation. I just wanted to share one passage where this problem actually does have bearing on what we think is being communicated. So, in Mark chapter 8, when Peter confesses Jesus as the Christ, he just says that. He says, you are the Christ. Who do people say that I am? You are the Christ, Peter says. Well, in Matthew, Peter says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. When we think about that for a second, Mark begins, this is the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, Son of God. The only people, or the only figures to recognize Jesus as Son of God throughout the rest of the book, until we come to the end, are God himself, Jesus' baptism, you are my son, transfiguration, God recognizes Jesus as his son, and no human being, some demons recognize him as God's son. No human being, however, recognizes Jesus as God's son until the centurion recognizes him as such on the cross. And that passage in and of itself, the centurion, is one that is seemingly a little bit different from gospel to gospel. So what's going on here? I would say that if Mark wrote after Matthew, then he leaves out Son of God for a significant reason, and that is that Peter had a partial idea of who Jesus was. But as their journey to Jerusalem makes clear, as they make their way there, the disciples are told that Jesus is going to die 3 times, and they fail to understand 3 times. And so it seems Christologically significant to me that he leaves out Son of God. Now, I have a good friend who would disagree, and I mentioned my interpretation of that, and I said, Peter doesn't say Son of God, and he said, really? Mark wrote first, so the fact that he doesn't say Son of God doesn't mean anything. So he might attach significance to the fact that Matthew includes Son of the living God, but not that Mark leaves it out. So as we get into passages, and as we look at, if you were to preach Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it is absolutely vital, I would say, to see these differences and perhaps who might have changed what. And by change, of course, I don't mean misrepresent, please don't get me wrong, but each of the authors had a reason to write, had a different theological agenda, and so this problem matters, how we sort it out, and of course the way we hold our conclusions matters as well. Hopefully none of us are holding them too strongly and saying that others just can't be right, because this is a difficult issue, hence the synoptic problem. One note I just wanted to make about the assignments for this week is in your contextualized application assignments, one option you'll have in the pastor track is sermon outlines for preaching Jesus' salt sayings. Just to be clear here, we're looking at the salt sayings in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and the passages themselves are very short, just a verse or two, but you will want to consider that in context, and so you will have 3 different sermons, and what I'm looking for is for you to be able to see the different ways that it's being used. So will there be overlap? Yes, but there are differences, and that is really the point of this assignment, is to get you to be able to present the same tradition of Jesus as Matthew presented it, as Luke presented it, as Mark presented it. And you might conclude that they are different sayings from a different time. You might consider them to be the same exact tradition. But that is the point of that assignment. So just wanted to clarify that. If any other questions come up for this week, please let me know, and I hope you will enjoy considering this synoptic problem.